Good morning, everyone. As Paul has said, I'm Chief Executive at Adur Worthing Councils, District and Borough Councils, so not LEAs as such. And I should start with the caveat that one always does at these things is, what I'm going to say are my views, not the views of my councils. I start really with a declaration or an admission. I'm not an educationalist. I never have been. I'm a consumer of education, both personally and my two sons who've just finished their A-levels. I'm very much a participator in education, having been a governor at a school in London and a school at Brighton. And I'm also actually somebody who, over a number of years, earned a crust in a consultancy business. And I set up, I think, in the end, 7 different academies. So I know a little bit about, but whilst I'm not an educationalist, I am very much part of a system locally of people, leading organisations and community leaders who are trying to knit together a number of agendas, be that education, be that growth, as we've just heard, be that health, public health, be that some of the crime and disorder issues. And so my perspective today very much comes from that place. What I'm going to talk about in particular is, well, let me go back a stage. I think during the course of today, you're going to hear a number of really extraordinary, interesting stories about great things that are happening across our educational landscape locally. I'm actually going to change the tone a little and raise some concerns. And in particular, some concerns about my worries about how that education system is fragmenting, both within itself and potentially away from the places that it serves and the community it serves. 2 problems I'm going to talk about. The first is what I call the problem of the fragmentation of the national school system. Just set a bit of context. Why might this have come about? In economist speak, with the demise really in the late 70s, early 80s of the post-war Keynesian consensus, Britain decided to go shopping. And it went shopping, it thought it was going shopping for a market economy. But when it got to the supermarket of political philosophies, it saw that there was a deal on. It was a bog-off deal, buy one, get one free. And actually, if you bought a market economy, you also got a market society for free. And my suggestion is that for about 20 years, we've been trying to work out what a market society is and how it works in a range of domains of our public and civic life, education being just one of those. In particular, how that might impact on the education system. And for me, the 2 things that I'm concerned about, one is that the links between education institutions and other institutions of place are potentially getting weaker. And the second, market economies and market societies, to be effective, require market failure. Fundamental problem we've got in things like education or in health or in the military or in the criminal justice is we just can't allow market failure. They are too important to fail. And therefore we tend to fudge some of these issues as a result of that. So how have some of those things played out over, say, the last 2 or 3 decades? So if I think about, first of all, about the school system, and I am old enough to remember right back to the introduction of LMS, or the local management of schools. There are probably some other people in the room who are as well. But we've seen a gradual reduction of that intermediary, that middle organisation, the LEA. We went from local management of schools to something called dedicated schools budget. And now we're in a very new world. We're in a new world where the Department for Education are actively promoting completely freestanding academies, completely freestanding free schools. We're in a very different world altogether. And Clive's already mentioned the way that the HE sector is developing. A free market, not just a free market, but actually a global free market. And in the HE sector, we're seeing that disintermediation, as I see it, from the local level as well, with a direct relationship between the FE colleges and a national funding agency or a national funding body. I'm going to illustrate this, I'm actually going to go back and I'm going to hop at 3 different parts of history and think about how schools related to their communities. The first, if I can take us back to almost Doctor Who-like, to Victorian times. Doctor Who always seems to end up in Victorian times. I don't know whether the designers like the dresses or what it is. But in a Victorian school, and I'm talking here about a Victorian free school, so a non-fee-paying school, those schools were predominantly established by philanthropists. Pretty much the local rich would set the schools up. The schools would have a range of active involvement in the way that they did business in their place, in their town. Usually you'd find the church involved, you'd find other local civic institutions, civil society institutions, the town council, the parish, the commissioners. Local influencers, the great and the good, the medics, whoever it was, the local aristocracy, would all play a role in that school. Now, whilst there were many downsides to that, one of the upsides to that was it was located in place, and actually market failure was evident and tackled locally very much earlier than perhaps it is sometimes today. I'll jump us on from that state of real connectedness to the 1980s. Many of you will probably remember this one, where you had an LEA, a local education authority, pretty much doing what the Department for Education told it to do in terms of relationship to schools. Again, I'm no great fan of that. I worked in that system and it didn't particularly always work very well. You had very good LEAs who actually maintained those relationships really well, and you had very poor LEAs as well. And actually, increasingly, you saw a dislocation from LEAs and the councils in which they nested. There was quite an interesting tension got built up there. However, for me, probably one of the most critical things was that there started to be more of a dislocation from the local institutions, the ones that we talked about on the earlier slide. So whilst, I don't know, the church may have had a rep on the LEA body, and a rep on a governing body, there wasn't that degree of connectedness that I think we saw in Victorian times. If I jump us on then to 2014, and again, this is incredibly simplistic, so I accept it's very simple. But actually, the system that I'm seeing has a direct relationship between educational institutions and a Secretary of State. It's very much a direct relationship. There is relatively little intermediation from a local place base in that system. Now, there are some strengths to that, don't get me wrong, but there are also some real particular problems that I think we have with it in terms of how we influence this. One of the particular issues for me is that we're increasingly seeing those institutions separate from each other and also separate from the other institutions of place. What's paradoxically sometimes true is that we're seeing institutions vertically linked very strongly, but much less well linked across to those other institutions. It is a worry for me, and I think what I'm seeing is not so much schools as islands these days, but more schools as archipelagos in their communities. And there's something there which I want to come back to in a moment. So that's the first of the key problems of fragmentation that I see at the institutional, at the system level. The second is actually at the level of the individual young person, the individual learner. What does that mean? How does that play out? Well, in a way, those two key issues that I mentioned earlier on, the dislocation from place and market failure, there are direct corollaries in the relationship between the young person and that young person's fragmentation from education. Market failure in the case of an individual is, of course, a young person who's turned off of education, who's not reaching their potential, any number of other issues around it. For me, our young people are actually forged in four crucibles. When I think about my sons, their peer group, young people I coach in football teams and things, I'd say there's kind of four constituent crucibles that develop them. The first is the family, and a number of young people will have really good, healthy, productive systems within their families that work for them. A number we know will not. The second is their peer group. Again, a number of young people will have healthy, strong, vibrant peer groups that will help them reach their potential. Others much less so. The third one I'm talking about predominantly here, is the school. And if you think about these crucibles, and my sense of these crucibles is that there's an increasing importance on the school to forge those young people, and also to increasingly ensure that they're part of the communities that they live in. The fourth is other adults, the other bits of the civil society or the social systems that they live in. So sports coaches, guides leaders, youth club. Once upon a time, I think it would be fair to say that the family and the peer group would be the connector for young people and these other adults. Increasingly, I'm seeing it's the school's responsibility to do that. Again, I think that's probably a danger for us moving forward. So what I'm seeing from this is that there are some young people who are forged well, who do extraordinarily well. We've seen Charlotte earlier on, and a number of other people that we all know, who actually are finding their way through the system and thriving on it. They are reaching their potential. But there are others who aren't. There are others who are getting lost and are not achieving, and we heard some of what you were saying earlier on, Clive, around that. one of the questions that I end up then asking myself is, what is it, or what does it take for a person, young or old, to feel part of the local social system that they're in? And having looked around for a while to find some good science on this, Bert Hellinger, who some of you will be aware of, so Bert, before some of his more controversial stuff that he did later in life, actually did some excellent work on human social systems and constellations, particularly within families. And Bert's views, or Hellinger's views, were that actually a person, in order to feel part of a social system and a connection to and within, needs 4 different senses. The first is a sense of belonging to that system. The second is a sense of loyalty, and a sense of loyalty that will withstand challenge and testing. The third is something of a sense of fair exchange, by which I mean that there's some reciprocity of value in it. They're putting something in and they're getting something back from the social system. And the fourth is a sense of role. Where is my role? What is my place within this social system? And I'm going to just illustrate this with 3 young people, 2 of whom are people I've met and know, and the third is a symbolic young person, I think. The first, and I'll call him Robert, was a young man I met in Worthing about 3 weeks ago at the Remembrance commemoration event on Remembrance Sunday. He was a member of a cadet troop. He was, I think, 16 and a half, he told me. And a young man who, whilst initially very shy, actually started to tell me quite a lot about his life and his role, what he was up to. He had a very strong sense of belonging to that cadet corps, that troop and his colleagues, very much part of who he was. And he then went on to talk about some of the issues within his family which were making it increasingly difficult for him to belong within the family. He had a very strong sense of loyalty to the values of that cadet corps. Even frankly, when he was out with his peers, and some of those values were being tested by his peers, he was still very solid in those values. He had a very strong sense of loyalty to that. His sense of fair exchange was a strong one as well. He was very honest about how much he hated squad bashing or marching in the rain. That really wasn't something he enjoyed at all. But he saw there was a direct trade-off. In doing that, he was actually getting the chance to do some badges and some learning. Particularly, he was interested in electrical engineering, so he was learning a bunch of stuff around electrical engineering. And he was prepared to see that as a trade. For his long-term future, he saw that was a trade. And probably for him, or the thing that struck me about him, the most powerful thing was that sense of role. And he was talking to me about when he was out with his mates on Saturday night. He was a big lad. I mean, he was probably 6'3", 6'4". He said that adults would avoid him. They'd probably be scared of him. And he said, and then he just filled up with pride of the marching that he was doing on Remembrance Sunday, because here he was as a cadet, and not just his peers, but other adults in his community were recognising him and holding him in esteem. And for him, that was an extraordinarily important part of his connection to the social system. Second example. So Robert was an example of somebody within that social system and thriving and certainly able to reach their potential. Second example I'll give is those somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 young men who've left the UK to go and fight in Syria, who've joined a jihad. And they've done so either as freedom fighters or as terrorists, depending on your perspective. But when you start to unpick some of this and think about what are some of the motivations for doing that? If you think about those predominantly young men, but some young women as well, their sense of belonging is far stronger to some people they've probably met on the internet than it is to their other Muslim colleagues or their peers or their communities in the UK. Something very, very strange about that for me anyway. Their sense of loyalty. They probably look at, and certainly some of the research I've seen recently from some of the young men who've come back, they actually can't see that there is any point in staying part of the UK. For them, there's something very strong around a loyalty to, if you like, the fundamentals of Islam as the jihadis would promote it, over and above the market economy of England. And I think that probably fits into the third piece as well, the fair exchange. When they are looking to see, is there the possibility of them getting great jobs, doing well, looking at jobs in the future, actually they're not seeing that sense of exchange. And finally, the sense of role. I suspect for some of those young men, as I say, and young women as well, that sense of role outside of jihad is really difficult for them to see. And we have an issue here, I think. And whilst I've talked there about jihad, in a different capacity, I run a charity that works with young men coming out of prison. And a lot of those young men have been in gangs as well. And actually, if you substituted the word gang member for jihadi, it's fundamentally exactly the same thing. Some of our young people are getting lost because we're not actually addressing some of these things. Finally, the third person I'll talk about is a young woman. It's not her name, but I'll call her Rachel. She's 16 years of age. At about 14 or 15, she got turned off from education. She didn't particularly want to go to school anymore. She is quite bright. And actually, if we put ourselves back into, I don't know, the 40s or the 50s, she's exactly the kind of woman who probably wouldn't have stayed in the education system, but would have, through one of the vocations, teaching, nursing, something like that, would have actually found a way into a career structure that would have suited her very well for the whole of her life. Perhaps one of the downsides of creating academic barriers to entry for some of our vocational professions is we're losing some people as a result of that. Rachel is somebody who actually, her sense of belonging now at the age of 16 is much more belonging to a community of her peers and one or two older women she knows, who work predominantly in what I call high street economies, so retail, beauty, healthcare, those kind of areas. Nothing wrong with any of those as careers, nothing wrong with any of those as approaches. However, the problem for her is she sees that as actually a limiting factor. That's all she can do, and she ain't going to try any harder as a result of it. Her loyalty at 16 is probably more, my sense would be, is more to what I'd call a media tribe. A media perception of how a young woman at 16 should look, not actually the aspirations for how young women at 16 could be, professions, careers, interests in science and a whole range of other things as well. Her sense of fair exchange is pretty weak, I'd say, to the extent that she can see no point in studying because for her there isn't another option. There isn't a career in science. There isn't a career in medicine or digital or anything because actually her peer group is predominantly, and her community is predominantly looking at high street, low-paid jobs. And as for a sense of role, I think she's struggling to see one. She's not seeing those other kind of opportunities in our community and society that I think she probably would need to see. So 3 young people. What I've talked about so far then is what I call the two significant problems of fragmentation. Education system and individual. One of the issues for me, given as I said earlier on as being a local authority chief executive, is how can we bring some of that together at a local level and turn some of that around. I should also say that there are a number of people, I'm delighted to say, I've been in Worthing a year now, there are a number of people across our education system who are alive to this and are already working on it. It's not as though it's a desert and a wasteland at all. My fundamental concern is that whilst individuals can do great stuff, the system itself is not promoting our coming together and locating an education system in its place, in its community, and that is a problem for me. One of the things we learn from Hellinger, but we also learn, if you think about it, from great businesses that are selling a lot of products directly to consumers, is actually you create a system that's not driven by policy forwards. I think I probably might describe that as a Govian approach to education. But it's actually end user backwards, which is what is it that the end user, the student, the young person needs to learn well and reach their potential. And there's a piece that I think we can do at a local level because systemically I think that piece is missing. And finally, because I don't want to keep people from their coffee any longer, across Ada and Worthing actually, we are having this kind of debate in a whole range of domains. So not just in education, certainly as Clive mentioned, in terms of the economy, growth, jobs and skills. We're certainly having it around housing, and we're certainly having it around health and public health, bringing together a number of organisations who, despite being channeled by government policy into particular individuated approaches, we can actually do a wraparound and bring together. And one of the things I look forward to, and one of the things I think I'm going to try and encourage a group of people to come together to start talking about early in the new year, is actually how do we get back to a sense of an education system, institutions and learners that are firmly rooted in their place. Thank you for listening.